Standing in a hallway with 1,000 eyes, you were 14 years old. Additionally, the man who was meant to keep you safe, your body was just given away by your father, the world's most powerful king, in a single inebriated sentence. At first, you don't comprehend. All you sense is that the room is frozen. The musicians cease performing. The nobility cease to breathe. The torches appear to flicker in shock as well. The elderly general who made the request, who is older than your grandfather, is grinning across the banquet floor. He is aware that your father is unable to say no, not in this location, not in front of the whole empire. Your hands start to tremble. Your mum hides her face. All the women in the hall are well aware of what has just transpired. Your life is no longer your own. Furthermore, the King of Kings, your father, does not give you a glance. He ignores you in favor of his pride, reputation, and the image of a god emperor that he cannot afford to shatter. He just uses one word when he speaks. The visitors applaud, of course. The general makes a bow. No one will ever hear the scream you choke as you stand there, because a king's ego is more significant in this palace than a daughter's misery. And her story really ends at this silent moment of public betrayal. She was a mistress, and what transpired with her is among the most unsettling illustrations of how total power destroys even those it claims to love. Subscribe to Obsidian Chronicles if you are fascinated by the hidden horrors of the past. Once you've hit the like button, let me know where you're watching from and the moment that most unnerves you. Now let's get started. Let me now demonstrate how a single choice made during an inebriated feast marked the start of 14 years of psychological suffering. Her story gets worse, so stay with me. You must first comprehend the world in which she was born, a world where millions of people's fates could be changed by the words of one man. Xerxes was more than a monarch. He ruled over an empire that stretched from Thrace to Ethiopia, from Libya to the Indus Valley, making him the King of Kings. He was in charge of around 50 million people. Furthermore, according to Herodotus, who addressed Persians who worked in Xerxes' own court, his word constituted law rather than counsel. He has the power to either save or destroy a country with a single breath. But the real threat wasn't found outside the palace walls. The Persian court was not a residence, thus it was inside. It was a silent stronghold. Eunuchs who owed everything to the monarch guarded a closed universe. No gossip got out, no discernible aroma, and there was one horrible truth that everyone within recognized. It was easier to be crushed by ultimate power the closer you were to it. Even members of the king's own family were subject to strict regulations that governed everything inside the palace, where they went, who they could talk to, and even when they were permitted to eat. Autonomy and privacy were non-existent. Additionally, the life of the royal house's women, particularly the king's daughters, was both exalted and scary. In fact, they were hidden, but in ceremony they were cherished. Even less free than the empire's servants were their treasures. Inscriptions did not commemorate royal daughters. The majority weren't even listed in official documents. They served as offerings encased in gems, negotiating chips, alliance instruments, and political currency. If you think that sounds gloomy, the next portion is even worse. The mistress's fate wasn't merely tragic, even her own people were terrified and muttered about it, because a single error did not destroy the king. In a court where his will was supreme, someone else was destroyed by it. And for a mistress, that error was going to be made in front of thousands of people, in public and irreversibly. There was a mistress in this world. However, she held an unusual role, in contrast to many royal daughters. She had the same name as Xerxes' principal wife, Amystress, the elder, who was described as harsh and occasionally ruthless in the inscriptions that have survived. However, the younger Amystress was born to a woman of Bactrian heritage who was a king's secondary concubine. Her appearance was considered remarkable even in a court where beauty was nurtured like an art form. She was raised by eunuchs and older concubines in the harem, the women's quarters of the palace. She acquired princess-like abilities in dancing, music, poetry, needlework, and sources that allude to something out of the ordinary. While other daughters were sent to faraway regions in strategic marriages, Xerxes remained close to her. In a Persian court, a father's love can seem like security, but in this case, it would be the beginning of her demise when everything changed after a single feast in 479 BC. Greek and Persian sources also claim that the specifics differ, but the general plot is horrifyingly the same. The most comprehensive version, supposedly based on accounts from Persian courtiers who eventually fled to Greece, is preserved by Herodotus. According to this account, Xerxes had been drinking for days, surrounded by flatterers who fueled his sense of strength and divinity. He took an oath by the Persian gods in front of thousands of guests in a moment of inebriated arrogance. Any request made to him would be granted. Someone in the hall understood this promise was disastrous. The elderly general, Artabanus, who had previously supported Darius, Xerxes' father, had already lost 3 wives. He was over 60, ambitious, and becoming increasingly marginalized. He recognized the political benefits of associating himself with the royal family. Additionally, he had another understanding. After being humiliated by his military defeats in Greece, Xerxes was unable to violate a public oath. Refusing a request at this point would be seen as a display of weakness by the entire empire. Artabanus soared. He bowed and made a request that no one would have thought he would make. He asked for the daughter of the king. He asked for a mistress. A thick silence seemed to engulf the hall. Guests, fully aware of the boldness of the demand, gazed between the king and the general. It is rare for royal princesses to marry common men, and when they did, it was to young, honorable princes, not old generals. Everyone awaited Xerxes' rejection. Everyone expected indignant.
Everyone was mistaken, because Xerxes was unable to violate the public oath he had taken. According to Herodotus, the monarch became pale, clutched the arms of his throne, and looked around like a helpless animal. Minutes went by. It took him many suffocating minutes before he managed to utter one word: granted. That ensured her mistress's doom. Later pieces claim that she made an effort to beg her father. She then pleaded with him in secret to break the vow and find a way to spare her the life she already feared. However, Xerxes selected the painting because he was caught between the necessity to maintain the image of a perfect monarch and true attachment. He used politics to justify his choice. After being publicly humiliated, Artabanus can turn into a formidable adversary. The court would be stabilized if he were bound by marriage. That's what he persuaded himself, reiterating the same defense that innumerable autocrats have used throughout history. A daughter's life is not as important as the state's welfare. 3 months later, the marriage was consummated with all the fanfare befitting a Persian princess. However, people who saw it had completely different memories. Amestris walked like a performer, trained to hide misery beneath the silk and jewels which were worth more than entire towns. The sorrow became more apparent and acute due to her beauty. Her expression was locked between duty and terror as she silently completed the procedure. Meanwhile, Artabanus exuded victory. In addition to a young, attractive wife, he had established a close, long-lasting relationship with the Achaemenid lineage. Even though the ritual was over, the real effects of Xerxes' choice were just getting started. They were also far darker than anyone could have imagined in that hallway. It was astounding how different their ages were. Artabanus was well over 60, while Amestris was only 14. This specific match unnerved the court, even in a society where weddings between young girls and older men were common. There were whispers in the courtyards and hallways, murmurs about how terrible Xerxes was to sacrifice his daughter in order to keep his dignity intact. And when the reality of her marriage started to come to light, those murmurs would only get louder. Because something painfully became apparent throughout the first few months. Amestris had not been married. A phrase had been entered by her. Artabanus kept his royal bride in almost complete seclusion because he was obsessed with controlling and showcasing her. Sources say he prevented Amestris from going to her family home or even talking to her sisters or mom. This severing of relationships was particularly harsh in Persian culture, where female relatives was an essential source of identity and emotional support. In Artabanus's quarters, Amestris was essentially imprisoned under the watchful eyes of devoted slaves. She had no autonomy, no privacy, and no freedom of movement. She may have attempted to send her father covert letters pleading for help, according to fragmented correspondence. However, Xerxes never responded because he was ashamed of his own choice and could not reverse it without acknowledging his weakness. She would be haunted by that silence. His conjugal expectations were the most unsettling aspect of Artabanus's treatment. Despite his advanced age, it is clearly evident from ancient sources, which are guarded in their language, that he frequently and coercively demanded marriage from Amestris. His fixation was having a royal blood heir who would guarantee his place in the imperial hierarchy. They called in core physicians. Payments to fertility specialists, herbs and mixtures intended to improve conception are recorded on administrative tablets. This was not for the advantage of Amestris. She wasn't considered a wife, she was a body to be utilized for political inheritance, a vessel. In 476 BC, after 3 years of marriage, Amestris eventually became pregnant. With great offerings made to the Persian gods, Artabanus rejoiced. The infant was a symbol of victory for him. The pregnancy had darker connotations for Amestris. She knew that she would be obligated to him indefinitely if she produced the heir he wanted. Mothers of royal children could not be fired, divorced, or released. Her destiny would be set in stone. Her pregnancy was later described by servants as being dominated by deep sorrow. Tears streamed silently down her face as she gazed for hours at the royal gardens where she had previously danced freely. Attendants frequently had to step in when she rejected food. The girl who used to move gracefully now only did it out of fear. She went into labor in her 9th month, a torturous experience that lasted for 2 days. Court midwives recorded serious problems. Upon the eventual arrival, Artabanus named him Xerxes in honor of his imperial grandfather. He was obviously dangerously weak. Despite the palace doctor's doubts about his survival, Artabanus disregarded their advice and started planning the baby's presentation. There would never be such rituals. The infant passed away 10 days later. According to official records, respiratory failure was the cause of death. But there were darker rumors going around in the palace's shadows. There were rumors that Amestris, who was so desperate that she killed the infant herself, was the only way out. Others said the kid had been deliberately neglected by devoted staff, appalled by her plight. No version is supported by any evidence, but the existence of these rumors at all shows how hopeless and intolerable her life had become. And the murmurs had an impact. Something horrible was unleashed within Artabanus. He became more violent and domineering because he was certain that Amestris or her servants were to blame. Workers claimed to have heard screaming coming from behind closed doors. They observed a woman with bruises on her face and arms. On one documented instance, Artabanus beat her so badly that she spent weeks in bed. Something inside her did not heal along with her body. Witnesses reported a severe psychological breakdown. The young woman who had once begged, resisted, and looked for tiny gestures of liberation was now a shadow in the world. She only ate when compelled to. She didn't say much. Her spirit was emptied out as she stood motionless for hours staring at nothing. Eventually, Xerxes was made aware of her condition. He didn't seem to realize the seriousness of what he had done to his daughter until then. According to some accounts, he attempted a covert intervention by telling Artabanus to handle Amestris more gently.
However, the king's power had little bearing on this issue. Artabanus sensed the king's weakness because he was now married into the royal family and knew that Xerxes had sacrificed his daughter to protect his own reputation. He knew he could behave without repercussions because his power within the palace had increased. Because the king who was responsible for her pain was also the one who was unable to stop it, Artabanus subtly reminded Xerxes in response to his secret warnings. The marriage was approved by the king himself. Additionally, Persian culture dictated that a wife's husband had complete control over how she was treated. Xerxes was caught in his own trap, and to question that would be to question the fundamental customs that supported imperial power. Amestris would stay with Artabanus if she took a step back, and her anguish would go on unhindered.
However, despite our best efforts to disregard them, history has a way of turning on the choices we make. Everything changed 14 years after Amistras's marriage. Artabanus and a number of conspirators launched a palace coup that resulted in Xerxes' assassination. The plot's motivations were intricate: long-standing grievances, opposing groups, and succession politics. However, according to other reports, Artabanus used Astras's suffering as an excuse for killing her. He purportedly informed his supporters that Xerxes had turned into a feeble despot, a man with such poor judgment that he had sacrificed his own daughter in order to uphold his reputation. It was a stunning example of hypocrisy. He used the same brutality as justification to murder the man who had permitted it. For a little while, the coup was successful. For 7 months, Artabanus ruled behind the scenes after seizing possession of the palace. However, Artaxerxes, the son of Xerxes, eventually organized loyalists, put an end to the uprising, and faced the general in the palace. After a bloody altercation with the royal guard, Artabanus was put to death. The same savagery he had inflicted on the young woman he imprisoned marked the end of his era of power. It is possible that Artabanus's passing provided gladness or even Amistras' liberation. However, the reality was much more sad. Amistras was 28 years old at the time. Witnesses, however, reported seeing a woman who appeared to be decades older. Her face was lifeless, her expression vacant, and her hair had turned prematurely gray. Her half-brother and current great king, Artaxerxes, attempted to reinstate her in the palace. He offered her the independence she had been denied, maids and private apartments. However, Amistras hardly ever left her rooms. She declined festivals, ceremonies, and banquets. Employees observed that she may go days or even weeks without saying anything. To cheer her up, musicians were sent one day. Before everything was stolen from her, they played a song that she had once danced to on that far-off night in 479 BC. Something inside of her snapped as soon as she heard it. Before breaking down in tears, Amistras let out a shout, a ruptured sound, and broke their instruments. It was the first time she had shed tears in years. She was not going to get well. Amistras passed away at 36 years old. Prolonged illness is mentioned in passing in contemporary texts. However, contemporary views point to something much more catastrophic: slow self-starvation, a kind of suicide that gave her the last remaining control. Others claim that physical degeneration is a result of serious depression. Those who shared her life knew the underlying reality, regardless of the medical reason. In 457 BC, Amistras did not pass away. The night her father said, "Granted," she passed away. Her spirit had already been obliterated, but her body lived on for 2 more decades. Unsurprisingly, her narrative was forgotten. She is never mentioned in royal inscriptions found in archaeology. Xerxes is credited with constructing Persepolis, the kingdom that posed Greece, not the dad who sacrificed his daughter in order to maintain his pride. Parts of her tragedy only remain in Greek narratives, Herodotus, and subsequent chroniclers who collected Persian oral traditions. Even there, she is merely a footnote that highlights the excesses of the Persian court, not a fully realized human being. However, when we look at the remaining pieces, the administrative tablets, and the faint echoes in ancient manuscripts, we can reconstruct the outline of a life shaped by sorrow. Sorrow brought on by a single rash decision by a father surrounded by sycophants and intoxicated by power. The tragedy of Amistras compels us to face a universal reality. The most heinous acts of violence are often committed by those closest to us, not by enemies or armies. Guardians, parents, and leaders with unbridled power and no morality. Xerxes did not hit Amistras. He didn't imprison her. He didn't order to kill her. But he destroyed her just as surely as any torturer with a single thoughtless pledge made to win over his court. This is the brutality of total power. Violence that completely destroys a life without leaving any apparent wounds. The tragedy of Amistras is the tragedy of everyone who lives under unchecked power, when the decisions made by one person affect everyone below them. Her story, which has only been kept in bits and pieces over the course of 2,500 years, reminds us that the worst tragedies often occur in the quiet choices behind palace walls, not during conflicts or uprisings.
decisions that powerful men never returned to, but their offspring never managed to avoid. If you were touched by this story and would like to learn more about the darkest recesses of empires and monarchs, please subscribe and let us know which historical character or civilization you think we should investigate next. Write a message in the comments if you've reached the end of this narrative so we know you were there for us this whole terrifying decline.